you asked me at the beginning of this conversation, like, what do I do with my students? Well, my first thing, clear away as much of this kind of modern baggage as possible. I don't care about your feelings. What does Dante really think first? And then admit that in this process, Dante might be a little smarter than you. Like, it's possible, right? Because he's sure as heck a heck of a lot smarter than me, right? Okay, so then why would he say that about the suicides? Why would he say that about the homosexuals? And to really get them to enter into that question. Again, what I'm trying to do is collapse those distances that are so easy. And I tell you, the number one thing I see teachers do that drives me up the wall, which is to give the students the one thing they don't need from you, and that is your own cynicism, right?
Wow.
It's like they don't need it. They have it in spades. And theirs is probably more grounded and founded than yours, Mr. Teacher.
This is Jonathan Pageau. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Kale Zelden. Kale is a teacher. He's a writer. He writes on Substack, but he's mostly someone who's kind of been swirling around the things that I talk about and that people around talk about. He's involved in this little corner, and he's also, he did for a while like a podcast with Rod Dreher, and he's just kind of been swirling around. And so we thought it would be a great opportunity to bring him to the Symbolic World Summit, to kind of hear his voice and to hear him talk about things that he thinks are important. So Kale, thanks for talking to me.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jonathan.
And so, I think that, we invited you because we know that you have this deep understanding of story, and you're looking into how can we connect, our modern world, with these ancient stories. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about what led you down that path on your own.
Sure. I mean, I've been a classroom teacher for over 20 years, and most of that has been in a high school context, although I taught a little bit as an adjunct and in low-level college seminars. And so I'm tasked with trying to help students who don't have a ton of background and do not have a sort of a deep experience of reading, how to not only understand old books, but to enjoy them. And so I've kind of been in the lab for a really long time, I run a pretty low tech classroom, as you might imagine. It's me, it's some students, a pencil, some chalk, and the book. And so, I have, you learn some tricks along the way in terms of trying to bridge something that is becoming increasingly a foreign experience or a foreign medium in the context of reading. And so I feel like I've been pretty successful with it. And it has driven home to me, this 20 years in the lab, that nothing is more important than connecting students to a tradition, not only just in terms of reading. I can't believe we have to call it the tradition of reading, but we do have to kind of call it that because certainly in the last decade or so, we are seeing, I think, a real melting away of young people who have, as part of what they do in a daily or weekly or monthly basis, sitting down with a book and, engaging these, the best that has been thought and written over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. So, and part of that for me is, I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1973. And one of the things that I experienced in my freshman year in college was there was this entire world that I had been mostly kept from. Originally, that was a kind of religious sensibility. I'm a Gen X Catholic, and so what was shocking to me was to be thrown into the deep end with Augustine's Confessions and even Plato and Aristotle, and especially the Church Fathers, both the Latin and the Greek Church Fathers. I sort of had this strange experience of frustration and I would say anger that the richness of our tradition was just simply not shared. And so I had to kind of go on you know, a, a mission, kind of like spelunking in the caves, looking for this richness. And when I found it, it was immediately resonant. The depth was immediately resonant for me. And so I think much of and of course, millennials and Gen Zers, I think that experience is probably even more profound in terms of that cutoff, because even in high school, we read some pretty good things. I read some Shakespeare. I read a lot of, 19th and 20th century American novels and, a little bit of Beowulf and, these kinds of things. But it really wasn't until college that I appreciated this thing that we all sit atop that had been essentially hidden from us.
Yeah. Well, I think I feel probably very similar to you. My high school was not great. We basically could pick our novels that we were going to read to do our book. And so people would just pick whatever. I think I picked Anne Rice or something, some kind of ridiculous type of activity. And it was only really, like you said, in my 20s that I kind of rediscovered or discovered this world that I knew nothing about. And a lot of the reading that I should have been doing as a teenager, I basically ended up doing like in my 30s, where I knew I had some catching up to do, and kind of delve into the dialogues, for example. Really only in my 30s is when I delved into Plato's dialogues. And so, I think that also as the fact that we in some ways had to wrestle with this, and I see the same with my children. It's hard to get them to be interested in these questions. I have one of my daughters is definitely kind of naturally curious and interested in these types of things. But what have you seen? Like how do you do it? How do you get young people to be interested in the world of ideas and of reading?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things I do is I sort of say somewhat rudely, but I'm kind of working a bit, is I just kind of establish at the front of my time with the students, typically in September, of course, is that I don't really care about their feelings, and not in that kind of Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings, but I'm trying to let the students off the hook in some kind of backwards way. Like, I don't care how you feel about Hamlet. I don't really care how you feel about Dante. I care about your ability to understand Dante or Chaucer or Shakespeare or Shelley or whatever we're reading. I care that you can understand it on their terms first, right? That I don't, like Dante's a perfect example, right? Dante, it's funny, Dante's not that hard to read. It's not like Paradise Lost, for instance, which I just got finished teaching with my students. And Paradise Lost is a heavy lift. I mean, I've read it now 21 times, and it's still hard for me. I'm on that page and I'm wrestling with the complexity, the gorgeous complexity of his language. But with Dante, it's pretty straightforward. But he starts to say some things that clearly clash with, the sort of the ambient moral structures of, postmodernity or something like that. And so you get, for instance, you get to the circle of the suicides, and and it's sort of a Dante doesn't care. He's not talking about, he's not really talking about suicide in the way that we think of a sort of a depressed kid or a depressed adult who, out of despair, does him or herself in. He's really talking about suicide as a kind of honor killing, sort of a self-honor killing. And so, so if I just let the kids read that canto, they're going to be, oh, well, Dante's a jerk. because he is, he's not sensitive to, what we go through or something like that. And so I want to do as much as I can to sort of put that on the back burner. We can get there. I mean, judgment ultimately is where we're headed, and we have to go there, and we can't be shy about judgment. But before we jump into judgment, we have to understand Dante on his terms. Like, what is he actually meaning? What is he actually showing us through these images? So I think so that's number one, is just sort of, putting what is your hot take? I really don't care about the hot take. Let's wrestle with what we see in front of us. And of course, when you do Dante, it's images, right? Really, how are these images working on us? What are they meant to demonstrate? There's a kind of, a language to image, which of course dovetails perfectly with what you've been doing with Symbolic World. And then, I find that with the students, they have a kind of affected distance from these books because they know they're old. And, like with Dante, they've heard about Dante before. None of them have read it before, but they've at least sort of heard of the Inferno. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to do with that is not to sort of put Dante sort of so high up on a pedestal that you can't touch him, that you can't, explore him. You can't kind of push back and let him work on you. So I'm doing my best to bring Dante down. I don't want to say it like that. Maybe I'm trying to bring my students up to him, like on some sort of platform and say, look, we can touch this. We can fiddle around with the images. And then I think the third thing, and this is, I really do believe that the key to all great teaching, especially at the high school level, is the power of analogy. Finding some kind of an analogy, where a student can sort of say something to the effect, I'm just like Dante.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I'm talking here about Dante the Pilgrim. You can get into sort of the esoteric about Dante the poet and all that. But I'm really trying to get them to connect to Dante through the power of analogy. And so to that end, I do my best to kind of keep up with their references, not to try to sound cool to them, but to make sort of connections. And one of the things that I've really come to love in the last few years, and this is also in part because my own children are high school age now, or one's actually in college, but I love listening to their language and, hearing, I'm a huge fan of slang, and the way that slang kind of wends its way. I think one of the great upsides of short form video is the way in which slang and memes can be kind of very quickly seeded. Yeah. And when you can connect that kind of slang, to something that you're reading, again, not to sound cool to the kids, but to kind of poke fun at their language as if their language just sort of comes out of nowhere. It's like, actually, your slang has a pedigree and your slang has roots into the tradition as well.
That's hilarious. I mean, I think that's a great idea. And it kind of leads me to my next question. This is actually a really big one. And I don't know if you have an answer, because I don't have an answer. Like one of the realities of our world is that, the roots of our civilization, whether we think of the Greeks, the Greek Golden Age, or even before the Homeric period, and the kind of Christian foundations, the Old Testament, the New Testament, Church Fathers, as time moves forward, we are getting further and further away from these characters, and at the same time, the amount of information is increasing, exponentially, and so, when you're in high school, your teacher might want you to read Kerouac, in English, or Camus in French, because there's something that's closer to your experience in some ways. But then I remember that was my experience, for example, of high school. But then there's a kind of eclipsing, you could say, of the deeper tradition and of the deeper past. And so, I mean, I guess my big question is, how do we do it? How can we both be aware of this ancient world, but at the same time also be aware of the modern one? How can we live in these two worlds without spending all of our time reading too? Because that's, like I'm not gonna read every novel, every modern novel, plus be aware of the ancients. It seems almost impossible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I all of us have to pick and choose, right? I mean, I'm the same way. I mean, I think in contemporary standards, I'm well read, but I look at even people a generation before mine. I think of somebody like I don't know, like Harold Bloom. Like, is there a book that Harold Bloom didn't read between, Homer through, Kerouac? Like, probably not, so I know that I'm not going to be like that, but I kind of think of it in kind of like levels. In fact, I've been trying to cook up a book on this. I don't know if I'll make it happen, but it's like, remember when people used to talk about albums, like actual albums, and there were the sort of the hits that were on an album, and then there was sort of the next level, and then the deep cuts, and I think we have to start treating the tradition that way. Like, in other words, we have to, like I would say, like, you have to read Dante, you have to read Homer, you have to read sort of the top half dozen Shakespeare plays. But that's actually not that hard of a lift, right? And then we could do the same thing. Like, I think you have to read selections of Aristotle, and I think you have to read, the Apology and the Republic, and with Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, Lear, Hamlet, that's a pretty good start. Tempest, I want to throw the Tempest in there as well. Like, you could kind of do that. And I think that that's something that can actually be accomplished either in a serious high school, or even a kind of honors seminar, a multi-semester honors seminar at the university level. So, I don't think that you have to read everything, but I do think that you should have these kind of layers. Like, if you read, you need to read these 6 books.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you like what you read, of those 6, under Homer or under whatever, Dante, then you can read these 6 below it. And I'm just picking 6 at random. I'm sure it means nothing. But you can kind of reverse build, a root structure that will give you a kind of sufficient background knowledge. You could do the same thing with, like, Dostoevsky. I think you have to read Crime and Punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I would love it if you read Brothers Karamazov, of course, but if you had to read one, I would say read Crime and Punishment, because it's a shorter
Easier
book.
to read, for goodness sake.
Exactly.
It's more of a narrative, like, the narrative is clear in Crime and Punishment.
Yeah,
for sure.
and it's got a courtroom drama, and I think that kind of works. So you can kind of pick and choose those kinds of things. And so, but I would argue, that part of being a sane person in the modern world is to do a deep dive. You owe it to yourself to build yourself out and to connect yourself to the tradition. And so if we think of tradition as experiments that have worked, like the Lindy effect or something like that, right? There's a reason, for instance, that we still read Homer. There's a reason, for instance, that Shakespeare has kind of risen to the top and maintained his position. And I'm always insistent to my students this is not some sort of conspiracy theory. Well, maybe it's a good kind of conspiracy. It's the conspiracy that's based upon co-breathing the really great stuff. Right. And so, we still read Hamlet because Hamlet speaks to something fundamental about the shared human condition. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I'm a perennialist, right? I'm not naive enough to think that we're just like the Greeks, or we're just like the Elizabethans. We're not, we're moderns and maybe even postmoderns. And, but at its core, these books hover over, this shared thing. And again, I would argue that you have a responsibility to plug yourself into this shared thing, with the added bonus that when you do, you find yourself, right? Or you find depths of yourself that were latent, but that can be awakened by these things. And so with all the noise that our kids swim in, this information overload, this fire hose of short form video, for instance, we have a responsibility to filter. And it is my hope that if I can get a kid to resonate, with an old book, they might just have a sneaking suspicion that the peculiar kind of depressive feeling that you get after you've scrolled for 45 minutes is actually not the same thing than when you do a deep dive into Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
Right. There's this experience that you can get. Like, I feel better after I read Crime and Punishment or fill in the blank. And invariably we all feel worse when we get caught into a doom scroll.
Yeah. I said I would never do it again, but here we are. We are announcing the Symbolic World Summit in May 2026. I have so many great people around me that I'm just excited to do it, even though I thought it would be crazy to do it again.
Our summit's going to be from May 14th through 16th in Broadview Heights, Ohio. You can buy tickets at symbolicworldsummit.com. Keynote speakers this year are Father Josiah Trenham and Dr. Mary Harrington, which is a combination nobody knew that they wanted, but I think is going to be absolutely incredible. And of course, Jonathan and I will be speaking as well as several people from around the Symbolic World community.
A lot of people that you like, that you've seen, are going to be there, are going to come. We're going to have book signings. It'll be a lot of time for people to meet and to greet. We're also doing Supra as well. And so come and join us. We can't wait for this, and we're excited to meet you in person. So this is probably going to be even more controversial question here I'm going to ask you, which is that, we have this sense that we're in a transition period. I think you probably have the same feeling that in some ways the modern world, whatever that is, whether it's from the time of the Enlightenment, whether it's more like the 19th century, there's a sense in which this way that we've been writing is reaching its end. Things are kind of fragmenting, falling apart. It's related to technology and all these kinds of things. As you know, Roder talks about reenchantment and this kind of collapse, or this like return of certain types of influences on our reality. And so one of the things that we've noticed, and that I've noticed, that there's someone who's interested in traditional Christianity and the Church Fathers and in that worldview, is that our curriculum is highly Enlightenment, lopsided towards the Enlightenment. And the way that we understand what is a classic book usually starts around at the 17th century, although we have a few things before. And so, so we've been doing this universal history episodes on Symbolic World, trying in some ways to recover some of these texts, like the Voyage of St. Brendan, or if you think of the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, that in the Middle Ages were so important, right? That had a huge, or the Golden Legend, let's say in the West, these kinds of texts. And so I guess my question is, do you feel like our canon is going to change? That the different emphases that we're going to have, or that we should have, is going to change as we move forward and we kind of move out of this Enlightenment, the dominant Enlightenment thinking?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about the novel as a form.
Yeah, that's a good example here.
As a technology. And it's kind of a remarkable and novel, thing. It kind of shows up. And you can trace the history of the novel. A lot of people will trace it back to Quixote. And that's fair. But there's this strange intimacy that a novel affects that has been good, but I think we've under-indexed the bad of that. And I love novels, but and I know everything before the but is a problem, but like, for instance, I think of something like Pride and Prejudice, and I love, might make me a weirdo, but I love Jane Austen novels. And, something like Pride and Prejudice is kind of a miracle, in terms of her ability to show us how thinking happens, how feeling happens. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. Something like Dante, not a novel, has these little moments where he kind of, peers through the page a little bit and then kind of quickly goes back into it. So it's not like it's an unprecedented thing. and Shakespeare gives us some insights into that, when you just have a character on stage and there's a soliloquy. Milton's portrayal of Lucifer has sort of these similar moments where you have this sort of strange moment where you're like, man, I feel and think exactly that. So I don't mean to denigrate the power of the novel, but the novel also gives us a kind of fake intimacy that compels a kind of inward turn that I fear can end in a kind of solipsism. And I think the novel has sort of done its trick. I'm not arguing that the novel's over, and I'm not arguing that you can't go and read a novel and get some amazing things out of it. But I don't think it's entirely. Where we need to go.
Yeah.
Right. It seems to me that the novel, that maybe you could trace sort of intellectual currents that maybe modernism or the Enlightenment, or maybe that's coterminous with the novel. So rather than tracing it to Descartes that people like to do, which is fair, that's one way to trace it. That's one way to make this little sketch. I mean, maybe it is the novel, and maybe the sort of because what's so weird in a novel, even more so than Paradise Lost, is that it can make you inhabit, a terrible person.
Yeah.
In a way that even Paradise Lost, compelling you to sort of get into Satan's headspace, still affects a kind of distance in a way that a novel doesn't. And I'm not, and these are off, I'm just kind of riffing here.
Yeah.
I've been thinking through this quite a bit, but I think there's a reason why the 20th century has this incredible flowering of the novel. I spent a ton of time reading, Faulkner as an undergrad, and I love Faulkner, but I don't know if Faulkner works for my, like, I haven't tried to teach, Faulkner in a long time, and I wonder if it would work at all in some strange way.
I'll tell you the truth. I never read Faulkner. I'm also from the French world, by the way, which people have to remember. But I actually just a few weeks ago started to try to read Faulkner, and I just in this world, I would say that I felt like he was demanding too much of me that I wasn't willing to give him.
Yeah.
That I wasn't willing to, that he was demanding a lot of me, and I just didn't have the energy to, it's like, it's almost have to base it on trust, right? It's like people are telling me this is amazing. And so dive into it. And so I'm seeing all these multiple perspectives and these kind of emotional, autobiographical ways of speaking. And I'm like, you know what? I don't care.
Yeah, no, it's funny. No, to argue for Faulkner just for a second, I think he's deeply mythological, interestingly enough, and of course the mythos that he's wrestling with is the inheritance of a destroyed people, right? As a white Southerner, so I think if we can frame it, if you could frame it like that, again, I get the lift. I believe me, I hear you. But if you could frame it in that kind of deeper, I mean, it's very Greek actually, in terms of the sort of the haunted house and the house of Atreus, and he's really working those things, but it's so deeply sublimated into what for most of us has become almost entirely esoteric. Right. Whereas for him, he's working through a deeply exoteric tradition that again sits on top of a presupposition of knowing all of the references.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, there may be a time, I could foresee a time that Faulkner has a kind of renaissance in 300 years. I don't know, but are we here in 2026 at a point where Faulkner just doesn't connect? That's a good question, and it pains me to say it out loud because I love Faulkner, but the novel itself presupposes a depth and a familiarity with the tradition. It's like jazz. I marvel at these sort of mid-century achievements, American jazz. And, it is astounding to me that there was a sizable, I hate to use the word market, for jazz in the mid-century. It's such a taxing form, both for the musicians and the composers, but for the two of us, right? And it takes a lot to kind of get yourself into this place where you can sort of appreciate it. And now it's like, and again, I know I've said these kinds of things on Twitter before, and people get mad at me. They're like, well, I love jazz, and it's like, no, I know you do. I don't doubt that you do, but it's also incumbent upon us to admit that it is esoteric. It takes a long time to build a structure in which we can inhabit to experience it and appreciate it at its depth.
Yeah. No, I think that all of that is right. Like the psychologization of the person in the novel is so, it's something that I think if you imagine in the ancient world would have just been befuddled, to see this kind of psychologization of the person. Although it's not that there weren't deep psychological insights even in Homer or in the ancients, but this kind of autobiographical.
You know what it is, Jonathan. I think it's, as we become less and less of a liturgical people, novels drain liturgy in some interesting kind of way, because it's one of the things I love about Shakespeare or Homer is that the language itself is liturgical. And I know, like, both of us come, we inhabit liturgical traditions. And so, we spend a portion of every week sort of plugging ourselves back into this kairotic I don't want to call it a performance, but this kairotic work, right? Yeah. That as we become more and more and more low as a church, right, broadly understood here, because all of us North Americans, whether we want to admit it or not, are by default low church people. The two of us have to kind of plug ourselves back into high church sensibility. But when you encounter the Iliad or the Odyssey, you see this, you're plugging yourself back into liturgy. And if you even think about the way that, an ancient audience would have experienced Homer, it would have been liturgical. There would have been the bard in the front, reciting, the litanies and the refrains and all these things. And I do not like when people say, oh, the epithets in Homer are just like memory devices. It's like, no, like is Alleluia and Amen a memory device? Is thanks be to God a memory device? Well, not really, or not exclusively, and not only.
And so then the question is, in some ways, how do we reintegrate these elements back into the story? One of the things that I've been playing with, been doing, in the fairy tales we're writing, is that in some ways I feel like character arcs, for example, that are the kind of not superficial, but like the most immediate aspect of modern storytelling. That they actually have something that is useful, that something that I think can be that can be carried over, and so going back into the fairy tales and having character coherence, for example, which is something that, the ancient fairy tales maybe didn't care about. Like, to ask yourself, like, what's motivating the characters in the way that they're acting, and so trying to kind of integrate that to maintain the fairy tale, but integrate this modern sensibility of motivation and psychological, and so the question is, like, what do you think, how do we integrate this stuff into the future? What do you see as the things that we should be doing or that we're moving towards.
I think you're right. I think there's been almost a kind of fetishization of character and psychology over and against story. I was rereading Lewis on stories, his essay or his address on stories, and he's steering it back into this question, because I think Lewis is such a fascinating character to me. I'm sorry, because he's one of the few people who could see. I oftentimes think that Lewis's genius was that fairly early on, like the early 1930s, he was able to kind of speed run both modernity and postmodernity. And he recognized that it only ends in the abyss.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look closely at his own career, as an academic, but also as a storyteller, I think he intuited and then did a good job of making sense out of the pitfalls that I think we're acutely feeling, 85, 95 years later. So I'm a Lewis stan. I love him. I think he's brilliant. And I have to admit that as a young English major and in graduate school, I was a total snot about Lewis.
What do you mean?
I thought,
like, you didn't like him.
Yeah, I thought he was unsophisticated. I thought he was kind of like and you can see this even now, right? It's the kind of thing that Christians feel safe talking about because, like, Lewis is one of us, that kind of thing. And so I think I bought into that kind of snobbery about how serious he is. And of course, it was total arrogance on my part, because all you have to do is just pick up a few of his essays, pick up, Miracles or Abolition of Man. It's like, this is a first-rate thinker. He has seen it all, and he has pre-seen it all in a way that I didn't really appreciate until, honestly, less than a decade ago. So for whatever reason, less than a decade ago, I sort of decided to do a deep dive into Lewis, and I'm ashamed. I have to atone for my snobbery in his regard. But anyway, in On Stories, he talks about the modern fixation on character, over and against what he says stories as stories, and which I think is what you have intuited and grasped with your own project about retelling fairy tales. How much time should you really spend getting into the inner psychology of Rapunzel? Well, it's like you could imagine some bad contemporary film on, the adult take on Rapunzel.
Well,
right?
Into the Woods is basically like the bottom of that.
Right. And it's exactly right. It's a bottom that actually has a floor, right? It's not bottomless. It has a floor. And at the end of the day, it's kind of just not ultimately compelling. Right. The simplicity of the story actually does this profound work upon the soul that fixating on, who Rapunzel had a crush on. I got making this up.
Whatever.
Right? Whatever. Right.
Or felt about her father.
Why does my mom always, make me eat peas? I wish I could eat, whatever. Or, these kinds of things. It's a false, ironic sophistication, that irony was supposed to be revelation, but it is turned into like obfuscation or something like that. And so Lewis, I think, names it. He says, there's a peculiar way in which, I think he says, like, a pirate is a pirate and a giant is a giant. In other words, there's something about these creatures that invite you into a kind of depth that a piece of internal monologue just doesn't do.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny because you mentioned how Don Quixote is possibly, the first novel, and Don Quixote is a comment. it's a comment on something that was sincere. Like chivalry was a sincere part of society. Like it was a posture and a way of viewing the world and of viewing relationships. And Don Quixote is it's a comment on that. And so there is this irony that is inscribed in that tradition. And, and you see it, especially in the 20th century, this kind of, this idea of, this notion that we always have to suspect the forthright, let's say, attitudes of people, that there's always some secret intention behind that. There's a deep psychology, there's trauma, there's all
and
these
it's twisted, right? And it's a twisted psychology, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because I think Lewis, as a great medievalist, would recognize that the power of allegory, right? That in other words, you do kind of hide in the story, but what you're hiding in the story seems to be of a different nature or quality than what a modern or contemporary novel hides.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, what you want in the allegory is more like an analogy. At least that's the way that I see it.
Yeah. No, I think that I don't want to pick a fight with Tolkien, but I keep doing this to you. But I think his sort of broadside against allegory has been really misunderstood.
Yeah, I think it's misunderstood too. But I think
woefully.
that he sees it. I think that the way that he criticizes symbolism, for example, is actually how I view symbolism. That is, he says my stories are applicable.
Right.
And so what it is that there's a deep structural analogy in his work, and then you can apply it to the world. It's not like the hobbits mean this, the king means this.
Right.
It's more of this deep structural. And in some ways, I think that he actually had a very deep understanding of story in that sense. And I think that's what fairy tales are, by the way, that it's not that, you could say, like, if you look at the coming of age aspect of the princesses, like of Snow White, you say, well, is it about sex? And the answer is, well, it can be applied to sex.
Right.
Is it about growing up and taking responsibility? And so, is it about finding love? Like, it's like all of these elements of the story can be then applied to your life and applied to people's lives, but it's not like, if you say, well, when she let's say when Sleeping Beauty pricks her finger, is that her loss of virginity? Is it her menstruation? So it's neither of those. It's her pricking her finger on a spindle. Can it be, is there an analogy to those other things? Well, yes, of course there are, And so that's the way in which I think that hopefully, my sense is that that in some ways is the future of, like, in some way it seems to me like that's the future of storytelling for us now, as we kind of exit this long, and like I can, if I think of the French novels, like, dude, I will never read Balzac. Like, I'm not going to read these people. Like, it's just not going to happen. So anyways, that's
and like, that's okay. Right. I think I subscribe to a kind of, living notion of tradition. Right. And there are times where novels go away, or stories, everything, they go away and they kind of come back. And I think that that's fine. Right. I don't want to set up a kind of house of bones in which we, these are the 36, real ones. And so I do think that there's a kind of fluid quality to the patrimony, that there are times and places for these things. Just like, look, I'm sure you've had this experience where, you picked up a book in the last couple of years that you didn't terribly care for when you were 20, and you read it now, you're like, oh, and so for whatever reason, it now resonates with you. And so I think we can understand that in a bigger sense. I mean, I think, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, like, what is this whole modernism thing? And I don't mean that theologically. I don't mean it in the way that literary critics mean modernism, but this thing we're talking about, and the modern world seems to be like, modernism is a solvent, right? It's like an acid that is at least conceives of itself as kind of getting down to a kind of base layer. And I think that that's yes, it's a solvent, right? It's a corrosive force, but it doesn't solve in the way that everybody in modernity wants to solve for X, right? That stories, as it turns out, are actually a much more helpful way of understanding and grasping and seeing than, these sort of myths of subtraction.
Yeah.
And I think that novels, insofar as they participate in that subtraction, will go away. But there are certain novels that very much take up the baton of, like the epic as a kind of genre. I think of something like Moby Dick. Moby Dick is probably my favorite novel. And it's, kind of like calling it a novel is to that doesn't really say much to call Moby, like, Moby Dick and, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. It's like, wait, those are both novels? In what world are these both novels, right? And of course, superficially, they're novels. But I think, Moby Dick participates in, the epic as a kind of sensibility. And it is trying to do something with a novel that has not been done before, exactly. And so it is more akin to the things that Shakespeare is doing with drama, or what Dante is doing with comedy, or what, Homer is doing with the epic. It's seeing itself in that kind of larger tradition. And it's almost like, you brought up Quixote earlier. What is so fascinating about Don Quixote is that he's writing it as it's already a phenomena, right? It's a critique, right, of chivalry and these kinds of things. And then in the second half, it's a commentary on the reaction that people are having to the first parts of Don Quixote, and so, if that's the birth of the novel, this is something I've actually been kind of wanting to ask you, like, at the end of the day, is modernity the same thing as postmodernity?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I thank you.
Because you're right that in the two Quixote novels, you have the modernity and the postmodernity. The second one is the postmodern, ironic memory of the first one, and inversion and play on the slippage and memory.
Yes.
It's all there in Quixote for sure. And I think that if you look closely, I mean, the postmoderns, if you look at the postmodern theorists like Lyotard or Derrida, like all of them, they didn't see themselves as, they saw themselves as, basically it's all there. It was all there for them in Heidegger anyway. So it's like, who's modern and who's postmodern? Right. And if you look at some of the the famous modern texts like Gargantua, Pantagruel, for example, these are postmodern. These are postmodern texts.
Yeah, I remember. I remember in graduate school. Of course, I had to, so as an undergrad, I had basically a kind of great books program. My professors would call it a non-great books program, because we didn't limit ourselves to primary sources, but we did major secondary sources and commentaries. We read, Eliade and, a bunch of the 20th century sociology. So it wasn't like the University of Chicago great books programs. But anyway, so we read Pantagruel and all this medieval stuff. And I remember going to graduate school. And of course, when I went to graduate school in the mid-90s, of course, it was all Derrida and Lyotard and Daman and Lacan and, all that stuff, right? And because I had this deep education in the tradition, and because I had read deeply in philosophy, both ancient and, post-Kantian philosophy, Heidegger especially, I remember laughing in my seminars because, my contemporaries were reading, Derrida, for instance, as if he was sort of saying something new, like postmodernism was like now. And I'm like, have you read any of the medievals? Right. And of course, and again, this is not because I'm awesome. This is just because I was graced with a real education. I'm saying, guys, you what you've effectively done, and this is like their timeline. It's like Homer, Plato, Aristotle, some Roman stuff that we don't really like to talk about. Okay, fine, we'll read Augustine, and then they'll just like skip the Kant. It's like they just skipped over 1,500 years of intellectual work tradition, and I found it even doubly ironic because here they are all obsessed with the logos, right, and logocentrism and all these kinds of things, and yet they ignored an entire tradition that's based upon in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
It was an exercise. I was continually frustrated because it was naivete masked as sophistication.
Yeah. But I think that it's often in the second rungs. Like that was a far more sophisticated writer.
Sure.
He wrote a text called Circumfessions, in which he kind of deals with Augustine. And there's, anybody who was
Derrida knew his stuff. Yeah. I'm talking about the practitioners,
like all the people in the school. But like if you want a postmodern text, dude, like Ovid's Metamorphoses is a postmodern text.
Yeah.
In terms of what it's doing the same thing as a lot of the ironic, subversion commentary upon commentaries that we see in the 80s, for example.
Right. So, and Jonathan, what book is Shakespeare absolutely obsessed with? Ovid. The Metamorphoses. It's the one that he references over and over and over and over again. So is Shakespeare postmodern? But like, how are we sketching these frames?
I think that's why, obviously this is why I do the things I do, which is that I think that if we kind of back up and we have a kind of full symbolic vision of reality, we understand that there is on the edge, a place for that kind of snake eating its tail, where things slip and things become move into this unformed place, or this kind of commentary and ironies and double ironies and all of this. And this is actually part of this. Like I said, it is definitely in Shakespeare. You see it, like there is this kind of self-referential aspect to some of Shakespeare's parts of some of Shakespeare's play that are part of the kind of postmodern thinking. And so that's why I'm not anti-postmodern. Like what I want is to to understand the aspects of that can be reintegrated in a fuller kind of traditional way of thinking.
Right. I always used to say to my fellow travelers in graduate school, my friends who were, you could never admit out loud, that you might be, conservative or anything like that, right? But I love the postmoderns because they are, in my way of thinking, recapturing a kind of medieval sense of play, and the idea of narratives and subversions and whatnot. It's just that at the end of the day, I believe in the logos and they don't. It really, the what is it? The infinitely deferred. Oh gosh, what? The signifier, right? Right. Right. A difference, and that I don't think that. I think that the signifier ends in the logos himself, and not in any kind of like pietistic sort of way, but like really kind of way. And so therefore, I could read, Heidegger and all these guys with joy, even because I could tell what they were. I think that they were trying to poke back at the Enlightenment and the sort of the sureties and the arrogances of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. So.
I want you to give us a little bit of a preview of your talk, and it's related to what it is we're talking about in some ways, trying to find solutions. What is it in the tradition that we need to let's say gather together and carry forth? And so maybe you can tell us a bit about what it is you're going to talk about at the Symbolic World Summit and how it connects to all of this.
Yeah, so I want to talk, true to billing, I'm going to talk about the epic, but I want to talk about epic, not as, a kind of literalist might say that, well, these are the 5 great epics in, so, Homer and Virgil and Paradise Lost, right? That's sort of the those are the sort of the four pillars of how people conceive of the epic, and love all of those. And what I'm going to say here is not an attack at all on that, but I want to steer a little bit more into, well, what exactly is the epic? Like, what is this genre that is perennial and independent of what we might call formal components? Is it written in pentameter? Is it, does it have 12 or 24 books? Does it have these sorts of things? And so rather than looking at the formal elements of epic, I want to go under the covers a little bit, and what does the epic represent? And for me, epic represents this peculiar genre by which we derive the sense that existence itself has meaning. Right, that this is the place where the human has to transcend his sort of mortal limitations and reconnect to ultimately to the divine. And so I think that this sensibility about the epic is exactly the genre that we are lacking as a sort of 21st century people, that we are a people that has been divorced not only from our epics, whether that be scripture or Homer or what have you, but rather we have been disassociated from the sensibilities of the epic itself. Right. And so, Jonathan, you talk a lot about, sort of postmodern irony, or modernist irony. And, the epic is sort of the anti-irony effort that reconnects us. So Moses is a perfect example of an epic hero. He functions as a kind of hero, a suffering servant who is called by, in this case, God. I am, right? But you can see the same thing that Virgil is called by the gods for this epic calling. And so every epic hero has their temptations to sort of settle, but there's something about settling that is anti-human. And so I think that in some way, our modern world is sort of one that preaches a kind of settling, that we can't really know the gods, that there's no such thing as calling, that God or the gods really don't care all that much about us, right? And so if you look at Homer or Aeneas, that there's this suffering quality to the hero that it's not free. Right. When you're called by the gods, it is an invitation into suffering. And, as a Christian, it's very easy for us to see this, right? That to suffer is to be heroic, and to suffer is to heed the call of God.
I think that's amazing, because in some ways this is the place where we are. I think every one of us is looking to move out of postmodern irony, and to understand its function, but then to not live in that irony, because to live with that detachment and that irony is literally what makes us alienated.
That's
and
right.
So how can we kind of, because I'm a modern guy, I have this reaction when someone tries to get me. I feel like I'm being sold something. I feel like I'm being, I'm being kind of tricked into following something. But I also have that deep intuition that you're mentioning, which is, when Christ was crucified, there's nothing ironic in his experience of it. There was some irony in the crucifixion, because everything is in it. But there's like he was truly there and truly participating and truly giving himself to that moment. And that's really what we need in order to move forward. I totally agree.
Right. When we can again look at the crucifixion, not to just the two of us, but when we can, for instance, look at the crucifixion and not feel cringe,
Mm-hmm.
we will know that we are finding our way back to an epic sensibility. Because without the epic, we don't mean. Full stop. We don't mean without the epic.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, I think that, there've been lots of forces that have sort of created this irony, but what I see in your project is how to be not ironic anymore, like post-ironic.
That's right. That's totally right. That's a good way. I rarely heard what I'm saying, what I do so eloquently phrased, which is Jonathan just wants us to stop being ironic, or at least to not make that our main
remember,
posture.
And there are so many different idioms of irony that you can play in, right? So there's the academic form of irony, which is sort of keep everything at a distance. And well, this was written by the J redactor, and there's this, and who was Homer really anyway? And what Virgil was really doing was this: he was kissing ass, or Shakespeare was trying to curry favor with the current sovereign. All that kind of stuff are just these ironic distancings from the thing itself, right? And if you recall, I mean, this is something, again, I'm going to bring up Lewis again, but Uncle Screwtape tells Wormwood, that we no longer need to worry about people reading old books, and he says because we have thoroughly conditioned, the priests of academia, the professoriate, into what he calls the historical method, right? And the historical method, and it is such a blistering undressing of what the academic process is, and it's like, we'll do a review of the literature. What is the, what is the current state of the literature? What are the, the redactions? All these kinds of things, all of them meant, of course, to disenable a genuine reaction to the book. So, to go back, you asked me at the beginning of this conversation, like, what do I do with my students? Well, my first thing, clear away as much of this kind of modern baggage as possible. I don't care about your feelings. Let's, what does Dante really think first? And then admit that in this process, Dante might be a little smarter than you. Like, it's possible, right? Because he's sure as heck a heck of a lot smarter than me, right? Okay, so then why would he say that about the suicides? Why would he say that about the homosexuals? And to really get them to enter into that question. Again, what I'm trying to do is collapse those distances that are so easy. And I tell you, the number one thing I see teachers do that drives me up the wall, which is to give the students the one thing they don't need from you, and that is your own cynicism, right?
Wow.
that when it's like, they don't need it. They have it in spades. And theirs is probably more grounded and founded than yours, Mr. Teacher. But give them the thing itself, right? To give them that, because I think irony, and the way that we're talking about irony here, I'm not talking about the irony of like a Donne poem or anything like that, but the kind of irony that we're talking, this sort of distancing mechanism, is poison.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Kale, thanks so much for talking to me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Symbolic World Summit. Hope everybody will be there. It's going to be a lot of fun, because there are a lot of people that aren't even actually speakers are just going to be there, and like just some great people that we all care about, and it's going to be like a big, feel like a big family reunion. That's my hope. And so thanks, Kale, and I can't wait to see you again.
Thank you so much.
The problem with history is that you are in it. Plutarch teaches us how to read power symbolically, asking whom does the person serve to predict leadership patterns before they play out. Join me for 8 weeks studying Lycurgus, Alcibiades, Lysander, Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian as living patterns, not dead men. Does the world look mad to you? This feeling of madness is something which we all share, especially the one who spend more time than maybe we should following the modern news cycle. Well, one wise Englishman once said there is a system in his madness. And one wise Greek 2000 years ago explained what is the system behind the madnesses of great men. Join me to read Plutarch symbolically.